First of all, Katrin and John, congratulations on the publication of your new book. It sounds absolutely amazing. And only having read chapter 10, I am really intrigued by your key argument, and by your thoughtful attempt to help social work professionals to reconfigure the relationship that they have with parents and why that should be at the heart of child protection practice. So I wonder whether you can tell us a little bit more about what the main message of your book is. Katrin, I'll come to you first.
I think like it kind of for me it changes on what day I'm reading it. And also it kind of has evolved because it started off with a curiosity about, what we called back then new public management, and which is probably now neoliberalism, and how that translates into children's services, which I was skeptical about. And then obviously the curiosity of how has it continued with changes of governments. But then as we were kind of writing it, I think, and as I spent more time teaching and looking at practice, I think I've become less and less comfortable with this extreme child focus. And I think there is a conversation that should be had about, if most children stay with their parents, and parents need to make changes for children to be able to safely do that, then how can we meaningfully involve parents and work with parents? And I'm hoping that the book kind of shows some of the complexities of child protection, and that also causes some limitation, but also some opportunities to work with parents in a more meaningful way and to hopefully reposition them to a more central position than what they have now.
Thanks. John, what's the main message you want practitioners to take from that book, or readers more generally?
Katrin and I were coming from a similar position in terms of having concerns about what we increasingly experienced in placement meetings and in talking to students about the way in which parents were often being marginalized, if not demonized at times. And so we would, I'll just talk for myself. I would be in placement meetings, for example, where no work at all was being done with parents, even though in most child protection situations, what parents do or don't do is key to whether the child is able to live at home with their parents. So the parents are clearly absolutely key. I mean, it seems a matter of common sense to me that parents are key to all this. And yet increasingly, because of the level of rhetoric about being child-centered, somehow parents seem to be increasingly marginalized to such an extent that I think both Katrin and I have had the experience where the social worker would be working with the child, but a social work assistant or a family support worker or somebody like that would be working with the parents. Now, that's not to denigrate at all the important work that social work assistants and family support workers do, but it seems rather odd that the kind of complexity often of working with parents should be delegated to others rather than seen as a central social work task. So that was where my concern came from. And watching students kind of being inducted into that view when they went into placement. Although I have to say that a minority of students, and I think again Katrin's had this experience as well, have been increasingly critical about that, and will say to me as a tutor, this doesn't make sense. Why are we ignoring the parents? Why aren't we seeing the family as a whole, and so on? So I think there are some encouraging signs of people beginning to question that. And I think the main message of the book for me is to reassert that despite all of the constraints that have come about through neoliberalism and forms of managerialism and so on, that social workers still have a degree of discretion, and social workers can still make a difference. And what Katrin found out through this research was that the representations of parents that social workers have are very powerful and shape the social workers' perceptions and understandings and what they decide to do with the parents and so on. And so those are very powerful. And so trying to have a message in the book which was about, if you like, trying to kind of deconstruct those representations of parents and identify what the different representations were, was, on our part, was a hope that by doing that, people would be able to reflect on their practice and move parents into more of a kind of center stage position.
Thanks. And one of the ways in which you're sort of framing that is around citizenship. I wonder, Katrin, if you can say a little bit more about why you feel that's an important perspective and how well embedded do you think that is in practice at the moment?
I think that's not something that comes from, using a citizenship focus is not something that comes from social work. And the reason why I think it's important is because what the kind of typology shows is that parents who are involved with children's services are mainly seen as the carers for their child. But there are so much more, both in terms of, like roles and responsibilities they have outside of being a parent, but also how wider social policies impact them. So for example, the 2-child limit of universal credit, the general austerity agenda that has kind of reduced services. And I think to see parents or families just in isolation without recognizing how kind of wider societal factors impact on them, I think it's just too narrow. And I think what we say is that citizenship can be helpful of kind of widening the lens and looking at parents more as more than just the carers of their children.
Yeah, and I think what I find interesting as well is that it might potentially help us get away from this kind of adversarial positioning of them versus us, because we're all citizens, right? So it gives us at least some sort of connection that has the potential to foster empathy and create an interest in each other's perspectives. John, what's your take on this?
I think it's inevitable that there are questions of citizenship in the wider context that Katrin talked about, but also that what social workers are doing when they work with families is, and particularly when they work with parents, is mediating between the state, which is setting in broad terms at least the limits of parental behavior and the limits of how children can be treated, and their social workers are mediating between that and the parents themselves. So inevitably the parents are having an experience of citizenship because the state is setting down what their responsibilities are as parents. And so I think that there is something going on in terms of citizenship, and there's no running away, I think, from the fact that ultimately there's a dimension, often a strong dimension of control about that on behalf of the state and what the state is willing to countenance and so on. And yet, in the citizenship literature, it's difficult to find a discussion of that kind of citizenship. So, for example, in the social democratic notions of citizenship. If you think of T.H. Marshall and so on, citizenship is all in terms of people's social rights, okay? And parents who are going through the child protection process, most of them are unlikely to be experiencing that as an expression of their social rights of citizenship. And similarly, in neoliberal conceptions of citizenship, which they've tried to push much more in adult services, then service users are seen as consumers. And again, I doubt that many, if any, people going through the child protection process think of themselves as consumers or customers, even though some children's services departments insist on calling parents customers, which seems quite kind of perverse to me. So trying to kind of unpick what's going on in terms of citizenship is quite difficult, I think. And it's also that we don't have many accounts of what intimate citizenship looks like. We have very general accounts about consumerism or social rights, but not about how citizenship plays out in the family and in social workers' interventions in the family and so on. So I think we've struggled with it in the book, and we've struggled with trying to identify what levels of participation are possible for parents in the child protection process and how important that is in terms of citizenship. And yet at the same time, knowing that ultimately there's a dimension of power and control and so on.
Yeah, I think I pick up on that point because I find it really interesting. You're talking about sort of what level of participation is there for parents, and it seems like at the best the options for parents are to comply, and if they don't comply, then there's a whole range of different forms of escalating that, and so I would hope that perhaps that citizenship framing gives us a helpful reminder that actually what we've put in place is deeply unhelpful, right? You're writing in this chapter that the main strategy in both studies to counter resistance by parents was to escalate concerns, and through this to increase control over families. So that seems very much that the setup is very much about an adversarial relationship where there's no win-win, right? There's a win-lose situation. There's an inequality of power. And actually, what are the implications for children when we have that kind of setup? Katrin, I wonder where children kind of feature in all of this from your perspective.
So the children access that the welfare of the child is paramount. And I absolutely agree with that. And I think what our approach and the book does is just go about it from a slightly different perspective by suggesting that child-centered doesn't have to mean working with the child or working exclusively with the child, but ensuring that the child has a safe place to grow up and to ideally grow up within their family. Because we know that the alternatives aren't great. The outcomes for children in care aren't great. So I think it's just a kind of it's not ignoring the child or taking away from the child, but it's just kind of repositioning the different parties that are involved in it, by arguing that parents are actually key in providing a safe environment for the children. And if we work with them in a more meaningful way, then hopefully that will also bring better outcomes for children.
Yeah, thanks. And I think that comes out very clearly for me just by reading this chapter, that the current setup isn't just detrimental to parents, but it's also harmful to to child protection, to children more generally, and it also has a real negative impact on the social workers. You're writing there that this professional ideal of social workers in both studies was to see social work as a humane and helping profession that offers service users support and initiates change through the interaction involved in the professional relationship. And yet they end up in situations where the only thing they have is a stick. The only means at their disposal is to try and force compliance. I'm sure that's not why social workers go into this job, right, John?
Yes, I mean, I interview lots of applicants for places on the social work courses where I work, and when we ask them, because nobody's ever said to me because they want to oppress mainly disadvantaged people. So they come with very high ideals and often very positive images of social work, often from either personal experience or experience of family and friends and so on. So yeah, I think it's important to, I guess it's one of the reasons that citizenship's important as well, that it's a way of saying to social workers or reminding social workers maybe of some of their initial motivations for wanting to be in social work in the first place, and to want to work towards that kind of collaboration with parents. I think, I mean, one of the other things that has a kind of detrimental impact is, well, I need to say that we, in a kind of summary sort of way, earlier in the book, we used Goffman's ideas about frame analysis to look at the way that social workers frame the work in child abuse through representations of parents and the way they structure perceptions and experiences and understandings and so on. And one of the things that Goffman talks about is frame traps. And this is when a negative assessment has been made of somebody. So a negative assessment has been made of a parent. And then when there's evidence to the contrary, or when the parent remonstrates with the social worker about some aspect of the representation that they're being put into, then that can be construed as, well, people like that would say that, wouldn't they? So the frame trap is that once you're trapped in the frame, it's very difficult to escape it. So that one of the things Katrin's been very clear about is that it's very hard for parents to disagree with social workers in a way that then isn't interpreted as yet another symptom, say, of resistance and so on. And Harry Ferguson has done some interesting work in his research following social workers around about the importance of social workers really facilitating parents to be able to give their view, rather than that they start to give their view of what's going on. And then if it doesn't concur with what the social worker thinks, the social worker kind of rebutting it and so on. But for the social worker, even if they're not particularly comfortable with what the parent's view is, to facilitate the full expression of that view so there can be a really kind of honest exchange about what's going on.
Katrin, I wonder if we can kind of ask one final question with regards to that kind of impact on practice. What do you hope the book can do for practitioners engaged in child protection social work?
So first of all, I hope that it starts a wider conversation around working with parents in child protection, and that it encourages practitioners to reflect on their practice, but also to have a nuanced conversation because I think it's quite tempting to push for like full participation. And when you read the Social Work England guidance, for example, they're all fairly kind of high on the ladder of participation, and I would say really idealistic, but there are real restraints in child protection. And I think we can't take them out, because if we are serious about child protection and we want to have a child protection system, we need to have the option to act in certain situations. So I think it's about having like a nuanced and realistic conversation about what is possible within the kind of restrictions that a child protection system, where you can have like competing rights and interests and limited resources, have, and for people to kind of reflect on their practice, and then also reflect on what spaces for discretion do they have. So for example, if we can't reduce the need to say what changes need to be made, you know, for example, to ensure the safety of the child, there is a space to say, how is this change going to be made? So can it be like, do they have to attend, like, for example, a group setting that a lot might be uncomfortable with? Or can it be something that is like one-to-one, or can it be in their house or somewhere close by or online, depending on, you know, what suits them best? So I think even if we accept that, you know, there are situations where the what can't be changed, we can definitely, I think, involve parents in the how and find something that, you know, it would be suitable for them.
John, what is your hope in terms of the impact the book can have?
I agree with what Katrin said. I think that issue about how can change take place is very important, that sometimes it isn't possible to avoid being prescriptive and so on. And I think, I mean, the overall message of the book is just taking seriously working with parents. You know, at its most general level, what we'd hope for the book is that social workers, one, will appreciate that they do still have some discretion, even though it's much more constrained than it was 20 or 30 years ago, and two, that discretion should be used to try and work with parents and to support parents in making changes. And I mean, in a way, one of the things we struggled with in writing the book was, well, what is the message about the book? You know, because we couldn't come out with some kind of radical turning the world upside down message about child protection. And we realized that what we were actually asking for seems incredibly modest. But in terms of where we are, it can feel quite a big step of wanting to get back to wherever possible, to looking at how change can happen and how that can be supported to happen.
Thanks very much for coming to join us and launching the book with us. And yeah, I wish you both best of luck with promoting that further.